So, Nikki, I was first made aware of you at the Froome Writers Collective that I was visited as the mayor.
Yeah.
Funny thing with that is that I was told by my assistant there's like, you need to write a paragraph about Froome and its collective creativity for the Writers Collective. And I had no idea what I was going into. This happens all the time. And so I thought, I'll tell you what, I thought what we're doing is we're just writing a paragraph and then we'll all share it and maybe talk about it. I thought, I was envisioning this like round circle of people that have come with things pre-written. And then I got there and I realised that I was actually doing an actual guest like talk.
Yeah.
And
Top of the bill.
Right. And I had about 4 lines. And then I asked if anyone wanted to ask me any questions, and the room was deadly silent. And so I made my exit. But it people seemed to enjoy it.
Oh, yes.
But I did feel a little bit, I don't know, not stupid, but like, God, I wish I knew a bit more about that going in. But then I saw your talk and I thought, well, this is great. So where does it start for you? Because right here on the desk, you've got, how many books have you got here? 4.
4.
And are these all the same character?
Yes, it's D.I. Jeff Lincoln and his team in Barbury, in Wiltshire. A place that doesn't exist. I mean, there is a Barbury Castle, but this is Barbury, the town.
Okay. All right. And so before we get to these, just move your mic a little closer to you. And then drop it down a little bit there. Lovely job. So before we get to these, I want to you have a very good, what I would call an origin story in the world of superhero mania at the moment. I think origin story is the word. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in writing, because you thought you were going to be a writer and then you were sort of dissuaded, weren't you, or discouraged for a little while.
Yes, yeah.
But now, obviously, you've fulfilled that dream. And I'm just interested in how you arrived here, and then I want to know about the character and the books,
yes,
and how you create a world in which a character is supposed to be a believable human being that spans over four books. So tell me about that. Tell me about your writing, your early years of like writing dreams.
I always wanted to be a writer. It was just something I just knew I was going to be an author, as I used to tell people. I'm going to be an author when I grow up. And I used to enjoy doing compositions at school. And I was just lucky in my friends at secondary school. We all seemed to be writers to some extent. And I think there was that competitive push so that we were all kind of competing against each other to write. And so I wrote sort of long short stories and novels and poems, and very influenced by Dylan Thomas. So my poetry was a bit derivative, shall we say. But people seem to enjoy it. I enjoyed the stories as well. And then I've always been very affected by place. And when I was a child, I used to spend my holidays at my grandfather's house. And it was an old brewery house in Crewkerne.
Right.
And he was the brewery manager, and his father had been before him. And my mum and my sister had grown up in this house, but I hadn't. And I just loved this place, and it just really captivated me. And my mum found some old photos of it, and this is about 1967, 1967, I think. And I was at that impressionable teenage age, and I just thought, oh, it's wonderful, this lovely house. And I knew it was rather neglected by that point. And then I saw a Ken Russell film on television, on the Monitor series on BBC, and it was called Dante's Inferno, starring Oliver Reed. It was Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, and Andrew Folds played William Morris. And I just absolutely captivated me. I was absolutely, this was the Pre-Raphaelites just hit me full on. And it was also the time when Jonathan Miller did his Alice, from Alice in Wonderland, right. And this wonderful visual thing of net curtains sort of streaming across corridors in empty houses. Everything just kind of all came together, just sort of coalesced into this push to record all of this, to capture all of this. And I wanted to set it in this house where I'd spent my childhood holidays. And so I'll write a historical novel. Right, that's it. So I had my character, I had the names, it was all kind of terribly, probably owed a little bit to Wuthering Heights as well. So you kind of got two different generations. And I set it in 1909 because I didn't think too much had happened in 1909. So I hadn't got to worry about the First World War or the Boer War.
Right.
Apart from Blériot, nothing much else happened in 1909. So I felt fairly safe.
Okay, so you could create
I could create it, yes.
Amazing.
So anyway, so I wrote this novel, and it was 100,000 words long, all typed by my own fair hand. And I felt I'd kind of finished it. I think I was off school with flu or something, and I think I was probably high on Lucozade and antibiotics, and I just got this novel finished. And I just felt absolutely drained, just completely knocked out. And I thought, I've written a masterpiece.
Right.
And people will just love this book. And friends at school thought it was wonderful. Anyway, fast forward a little while. I'd left school. I had a job in a training college as a library assistant. I was too young to go to library school. And I sent it off to publishers and didn't know about agents. You're supposed to use an agent first. And Livia Gallantz wrote back and said very politely, it's quite an achievement for somebody of your age. But steer clear of dialect and perhaps have something set in the present day. Good luck.
Right. Who is that, Olivia? Because you've name dropped her, so I imagine she's
she
someone
was.
in that world.
Gallantz were the main publishers of certainly things like science fiction and lots of other popular fiction in the sort of from post-war onwards, really. Olivia
to receive
was
a personal response.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Is quite something. Isn't
Yes,
it?
yes. But things like at that point, I wasn't sure whether Olivia was male or female, so I couldn't really sort of say much about it. But anyway, I just sort of so disappointed, and I think I was just so shocked that nobody spotted my genius.
Right.
And so I kind of thought, well, so what? And then I went to library school, and I was still writing, and still sulking that this brilliant book had been turned down. And then obviously, I kept on writing. I was working in libraries because I was kind of thinking I'd sneak into the back of publishing by working with books in some way or other.
Right.
And actually, I did love librarianship. I loved being in libraries. So I did enjoy that. Then I've really loved the series Shoestring.
Right.
Do you remember? That's long before your time, of course. But it starred a very young Trevor Eves.
Right.
Eve, and it was set in Bristol. I love Bristol. I grew up in Salisbury, so we used to go to Bristol for things from school to the theatre and so on.
Right.
And
so it's got a nice place in your heart as a place of sort of fun and culture.
well, it has, yes. And Shoestring was set in Bristol, and he was the character was Eddie Shoestring, and he was a radio presenter.
Right.
But sort of as a sideline, he sort of did a bit of a private eye, and he'd sort of try and sort out these crimes and things. And it was a great romp, but it was quite a short-lived series. And when it finished, I was so disappointed, and I thought, well, perhaps I could write something in that kind of vein.
Right. So
I created this character called Eddie Andrews, and he didn't work in a radio station. He lived in London, because I was living in London. And he worked, I'm sure Ricky Gervais didn't ever see this, but he worked in this company that sold wholesale stationery. And a bit like The Office. And Eddie, I can actually see Martin Freeman would make a brilliant Eddie Andrews. And Eddie had fallen out with his boss, had a big row, walked out, and his friend said, "Oh, it's stupid, you mustn't do that, go and apologise." He said, "No, I bet you that in a year I could make as much money answering small ads as if I went and grovelled to get my job back." So it was called The Small Ads Man.
Right.
And Eddie took various jobs he found in the small ads in the Evening Standard. Those were the days. And eventually, these tasks he took on got more and more sort of dark and criminal. and until there was some sort of big climax. And anyway, I sent it off to an agent. I'd found out about agents by then, and we're talking about 1984, so it's quite a while ago.
Right.
And because I'd kind of written it from Eddie's point of view, so it was a male perspective, I thought, well, better not sort of send it off as, my name. So I sent it off by Nick Copleston and heard nothing at all. And then I was at work in the library on Holloway Road in Islington, and sort of everybody else had gone home, and the phone went. And I thought, can I speak to Nick Copleston, please? And I thought, and I just, it was just one of those moments where you think, oh God, what do I say?
So what did you do? Did you go, speaking?
No, I had to say, I said, who is this? And it was David Grossman, the agent.
Right.
And I said, I've got to come clean. I am Nick Copleston, but, and I explained. And he was just really taken with the manuscript. And he said, it's wonderful, it's a picaresque piece. Picaresque. And I was just, I walked on air for days after that, and I went to see him, and he was tickled pink that I was actually a woman writing this male from a male perspective.
See, I thought that would have been a very a common thing in writing, because the Bronte sisters wrote under pseudonyms, didn't they?
Yeah, but that was a bit long ago.
Time ago. But,
and I suppose
there's a tradition of successful writers using different names, isn't there?
But I suppose you get P.D. James, you wouldn't know what gender she was, would you, from that, I suppose. But I just thought it would give more credibility that it was, Nick Copleston had written this. Anyway, David managed to get it looked at by Bodley Head, but he couldn't actually place it. And I was disappointed, obviously. But it hadn't really occurred to me at that point, what I was writing. I was just writing things I enjoyed doing. And so I kind of put it to one side, and then work got busier. I moved from Islington to another London borough, and so work just piled on, and I didn't write much for a while. And then in 1986, just before Christmas 86, there were 2 murders that took place in Salisbury within the same 24 hours. And my father had actually taught one of the victims. And it just shook me up so much, this idea of Salisbury, which is somewhere I'd grown up, and it seemed, it was never the sleepy Wiltshire town that people would have you say it is, because there were always squaddies around at the weekends. It was quite a rough place in many ways, but that's not what the tourists would see, of course.
Yeah.
And something began to go around in my head about these murders, and somehow just I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me before to actually write for a particular genre. And I suddenly thought, because I read lots of crime novels, perhaps I should write a crime novel.
Right.
And I had as the sort of starting point was what happened with one of these murders, that a woman had stopped on the outskirts of the town to use the public toilets. She'd been attacked by a lavatory attendant and murdered. And it got me thinking about, I drive around places now for work. I stop strange places, and that could have been me possibly, because she was just doing market research. She wasn't doing anything risky. She'd come from Hampshire to Salisbury to meet somebody to talk about some market research. So it was completely out of the blue, unexpected.
Do you think it was that degree of separation from, was it 2 degrees your dad taught her? Was it 1 or 2 degrees? Dad
taught the other victim.
Right.
It was just the fact that he was so shocked, and the whole thing was just so shocking.
It made it very real for you, I guess.
It did. And my mum had died the previous year, and I think I was feeling a bit homesick, I think, for Wiltshire.
Right.
Living in London, couldn't see any way of ever moving out of London at that point. And I think I wanted to capture Salisbury. But I couldn't call it Salisbury because I didn't want anybody thinking, oh, well, you're using that case of, the poor woman who was killed. So I had to disguise it.
Is that a case of artistic integrity or a sort of a moral thing? So you don't, or both. So you don't appear like you're sort of mining someone else's grief and tragedy for.
Yeah, I'm a bit of both, really, because I didn't want anybody to say, oh, well, you got the idea from what happened to that woman. But at the same time, I felt unhappy for her because it was just before Christmas and it was before the internet, so they just had the newspapers being sensational about, oh, she wasn't where she was supposed to be, mystery of the appointment she didn't keep. And I thought, well,
The blame on her for being murdered.
almost,
in some ways.
and she wasn't glamorous. She wasn't young and glamorous. She was in her 40s. She had sort of big goggle glasses, and there's only rather unflattering photo of her. And it just seemed she was being exploited, and I didn't want to kind of carry on with that exploitation. But at the same time, I thought, well, I kind of want to speak up for the victims and the people left behind, which is why the books have never been. I've never had murders which kind of have things carved on the bodies or people arranged in particular ways of symbolic significance, which I know other people like that kind of thing, and the sort of serial killers. But I want to see something more authentic, and get across that more. So anyways, that would probably late 80s, I suppose. I began to think, I could perhaps create a crime writer. Because I'd gone on writing in a small way, and there'd been crime creeping into each of the novels I'd written, nothing ever successful. And then it was about 1990. I actually did create Jeff Lincoln and started on The Price of Silence, which I wrote. It was very long, very baggy. I painted myself into various corners. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was kind of doing it in fits and starts. And then I said, work got more, busy. Life happened. And then eventually, I'd never gave up hope of perhaps getting it published. I sent it off to agents, and I got some nice feedback, but not for us. It was very long and so very baggy. And when
you say baggy in a explain what you mean by that in terms of it was just
kind
a bit
of rambling the plot was very kind of not kind of sort of sharp enough. It wasn't clear enough, what happened, what the consequences of one thing, and it was just
sort of lots of little narrative whims. And
a bit. It was just there was just too much of it, really.
Right. Okay.
It was about twice the length that it ended up as.
Right.
And so I really did pretty much put it in the bottom drawer because I couldn't place it. And also, of course, as time went on, things like the internet came in and the mobile phones and all of this, so it was getting rather out of date. And then I got made redundant in 2011. And I thought, now I can write. So I sat down and I was writing this novel, sort of about four women in their sort of 50s who some big life-changing thing happens, and I was getting so bored with it. And I thought, and one of them gets involved in some criminal thing, and I've sort of brought in this character. I thought, I can use that Jeff Lincoln character, and things began to kind of get a bit more exciting. And I thought, well, actually, perhaps I don't really want to desert him after all.
Yeah.
And so I parked this thing about these women in their 50s, and I thought,
now, is that bad when you start to bore yourself writing it? Is that a bad thing, or is that a thing that happens?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, yes, you can bore yourself, but you sort of think, well, if I'm getting bored, the reader's getting bored.
Right.
And, it's not like the old Raymond Chandler thing, something starts to flag, you kind of get a guy coming through the window with a gun. You can't really do that with every novel. Some genres you can.
Yeah. So it seems to be a theme of sort of women, older women or women in their middle ages creeping into your work. What do you think that is? Do you think they're just generally more interesting, like they could be a bit more well-rounded characters or human beings to explore?
I suppose there aren't enough books written about them, I suppose. And I was probably feeling a bit out of touch with what, say, a 30-year-old woman would be like. It's quite strange reading some of my older novels that I wrote when I was in my 30s, 20s and 30s, and thinking, oh, gosh. I'm thinking, well, if people don't write and keep things they wrote when they were that age, how do they know what they were like then? It's a bit strange.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I took early retirement and was going to write. Decided perhaps I should write a crime novel. And so I wrote a new thing with Jeff Lincoln, with the Shame of Innocence. And I suddenly thought, why didn't I think before? I'm a librarian, I'm a reader, I go into bookshops. Why didn't I think before that I should choose a genre instead of just writing these rather slightly general novels? So I wrote that and I embarked on it. We moved to Wells in 2012 and I thought, what's this writing lark? Can I really carry on with this? Is it worth it? And then Alison Klink from Frome who's done a lot with the Frome Festival. She's a short story writer. She's written novels and a memoir. She was running a creative writing course in Wales for Somerset Skills and Learning. And I thought, do I swallow my pride and admit I need to learn a bit more about writing? And I signed up for it. And it was just such an eye-opener because I really felt, humbled in one sense, realising how good people's writing was. I wasn't actually this sort of wunderkind that I thought I was in my teens. But also I did get some nice feedback, so I knew that I just needed to polish what I was doing. Alison was wonderful. She was so encouraging, and when this course in Wales ended, she said, well, come over to Frome College. I'm doing a course there. So I went to that. And then Frome Writers Collective was started in 2014. And that was another sort of milestone as far as I was concerned, to be with other writers and have feedback.
Because it sounds like you were sort of a lone wolf a little bit for
many
years.
Well, I was, yes, because I didn't think I needed anybody else,
Right.
I mean, this is, I'm somebody who, when I was younger, I wouldn't read anything by anybody younger than me. That's how resentful.
Right. Where do you think this I don't want to say arrogance, but where did this sort of bloody-mindedness come from, and this headstrong attitude come from towards writing and knowing that you're really good, or not reading anything from anyone younger than you? Where do you think that comes from?
I think it probably is arrogance, but
There's
also
an anger in there.
I think I just was so convinced that I'd written something brilliant with this very first novel I wrote in my teens. And I just knew I loved writing, but I just hadn't quite got it all together. It just hadn't quite gelled properly. And I think I thought I'd sit back and have somebody discover me.
Right.
It doesn't work like that. You have actually got to be very proactive. And that's really what Frome Writers Collective helped me with, because I knew I had to actually make some effort, contribute, put myself out there. I couldn't just sort of sit back and hope somebody would spot my work and say, oh, you're brilliant, where have you been all these years? So with the help of Frome Writers Collective, Silver Crow Books was formed, which is an imprint which helps writers get feedback on their manuscripts, suggests sort of editorial changes, and also offers support in knowing how to get that book published, and when it's published, giving support in promoting it. And so The Shame of Innocence was the first book that Silver Crow helped publish. I was kind of a bit of a guinea pig in 2016 when I sent in my manuscript, and this came out in November 2016, when Silver Crow was kind of officially launched.
Right.
But I'd still got this one lurking in a drawer somewhere.
The bottom drawer, because
But
they're always the biggest.
well, exactly, yes, exactly. And I kept thinking, oh, what do I do? Because if anybody says, oh, what else have you written? Because obviously it was a backstory alluded to in this one.
Right.
And I kept thinking, if I say to people, well, you can, it's an e-book, you can get it on Amazon, would I really want them to find it?
Right.
And the gap between the writing of this one, the original of this one, and The Shame of Innocence. The Shame of Innocence, there were mobile phones, there was the internet, a completely different way of investigating a crime than what I'd originally written about in the 1990s with the very first version of the first Jeff Lincoln.
So that is interesting that in this second book, The Shame of Innocence, you have alluded to the existence of the first book. So you have enough confidence in at least distilled elements of that story still. So it's still in there. You know that there's something in there when you're writing that. It's interesting that you then go, many bands do this as well. And they a lot of people will say you have your whole life to write your first album, or you have your whole life to write your first book.
Yes.
And I think most people expect the first attempts of these things to be incredible because you've had, 20, 30 years, let's say. But, editing is important, isn't it? And so it's very interesting that you've had enough confidence still in your first effort with Lincoln to think about, at least shining a light on this book and it maybe being found, because as you've said, it's probably not your best work at that point, because I know obviously you've gone back to it now. So it's interesting that you've got the confidence in it. So maybe that was it. Maybe that was subconsciously, that was your way of forcing yourself to go back.
I think it was, because I really did. I mean, after this one came out, the publisher commissioned a stately grey distilled, a novella with the same characters,
Right.
Which has to be set just before this one, because I'd already begun to think of what happened after
So it's
that.
like a mini prequel.
Yes. But
Excellent.
this was still haunting me, and I thought,
Right.
do I go back and rewrite it? Do I have the nerve? And
Were you scared of what you might find?
yes, I think I was. I just thought, is it stupid to embark on that? Should I just keep going forward?
Right.
And I thought, I mean, who publishes books in reverse order? Because that, in effect, was what I was doing. But I'm just so glad I did, because it kind of got rid of that shame of thinking, oh dear, if only I'd done it properly the first time.
What could have been?
Well, exactly, because I was still proud of the ideas I'd had for this. And the way in which, for instance, in this you find out how Lincoln lost his wife, whereas here he's already lost her, he's recovering. So you find out why he bought this old vicarage that's a real fixer-upper,
Right.
a money pit, really. You find out why he did, whereas in The Shame of Innocence, he's there and he's still not fixing it up. But, I mean, he's in this house and you think, well, why did he do that? This tells you why he did that.
Okay. I guess we should maybe talk about him a little bit as a character, because you've just said to me how his wife died. And I thought, his wife's dead? All great detectives or sort of police dramas, there is a dead wife who in flashbacks is absolutely perfect.
Yes.
Always, greeting them with a kiss in the morning, before and after work. Just the perfect wife. And then she's ripped away by the underworld or something.
It's more complicated than that.
Right. Oh, tell me all about it, please.
Well, what's happened is that Lincoln's kind of neglected his wife rather, and it's quite subtly alluded to, but he does play away a little bit. He always has done. The odd flings, but his wife Kathy has been attracted to a teacher who's a very sort of left-wing chap and very sort of soft-natured and mild-mannered, probably a bit anti-police.
Right, the opposite.
The opposite of Lincoln.
I see.
And she falls for Andy, and so she moves out and leaves Lincoln, and then she's killed. She's run down by a joyrider when she's walking home from work one night. And of course, Lincoln blames himself. I mean, he blames her lover to start with, Andy Bloody Nightingale, who stole her away. But he also blames himself. And I think that's one of the themes of this, is that he still can't quite get over that, a lot of it was his fault, that he neglected her, what they could have had, because they were, real lovey-dovey at the beginning, when they were first together in London. But hopefully he'll find love. But his relationship with Trish, the librarian who crops up all through this, is very on and off. And that's partly, I think, because whenever I've read crime novels and the main character, detective, is happily married, I think, it's boring. I like that possibility and that kind of uncertainty about relationships with the main character, rather than having him happily married off, which always seems rather cosy to me. I mean, and a lot of readers like that. I mean, say with Wexford and his wife and the daughters and everything, but that just a kiss of death to me as a reader.
Right.
That kind of sort of coziness.
Yeah, well, I guess it adds an element of complacency to a character, doesn't it?
Yes.
They can, if everything's squared away and perfect.
Yes.
It's not very compelling, is it?
No.
It isn't, is it? But I guess what's more interesting is, we have people in life that always seem to have like the most perfect marriages or relationships, and you think, what is going on here?
Yes.
What's going on when these doors are shut?
Yeah.
There's something off about you guys. That would be an interesting take on that sort of a picturesque thing. But yeah, I definitely I like my detectives and stuff to be flawed.
Yes.
Individuals, like brilliant but flawed individuals. And Sherlock is the same.
Yes.
Luther is the same from the TV. Going into video games, Max Payne is the same. His wife and child were murdered. He has an addiction to painkillers and is an alcoholic, and he's very much a sort of grimy New York noir kind of. There's a narration going on. So we love a flaw. It's kind of like anti-heroes in a way, isn't it? Because they're humans that are very flawed, that aren't necessarily always great role models, but somehow we end up caring about them and wanting them to succeed and thrive, and maybe even an element of a sort of a redemption arc somewhere.
Yes.
So yeah, very interesting. I do like a good detective. They're all very interesting characters. I see that you've got some. Maybe you had a train of thought that I'm going to derail here, but I see that you've got some newspaper cuttings and stuff.
Yes, I mean that was the.
Is this from the murder thing?
That was the
right
1986.
So we've got some audio listeners. So I'm just going to read this out. Man accused of Salisbury death. We've got a newspaper cutting here. Detectives investigating the brutal killings of 2 women in Salisbury charged a man with the murder of one of them last night. Mr. Alexander, what's this second name? McInnes, a public lavatory cleaner employed by Salisbury District Council, was accused of murdering Mrs. Beryl Deacon, aged 44, from Ringwood, Hampshire, whose body was discovered in lavatories in Salisbury early on Sunday. I won't read any more, but interesting. Very interesting. And these killers, sometimes they just seem to be people that have very sort of like, he's just a lavatory. I don't want to put anyone down who's a lavatory cleaner, but it doesn't, they seem to have these kind of jobs that are very kind of on your own.
Yes.
Sort of seem quite lonerish or they're not very particularly, I would imagine it to be very fulfilling.
No, I mean, he was actually originally from Scotland. I mean, I don't know how long he'd lived in Salisbury, but I mean, through the Facebook group sort of dedicated to Salisbury history, somebody commented that he played pool with him the night before. So he's a chap who'd go into a pub. I mean, both the killers were men who'd go into the pub and you wouldn't think twice about it. You might think, oh, he looks a bit tough guy.
Right.
But you wouldn't think, oh, there's a killer.
Most of the killers that we see on the news and serial killers, they don't present themselves to be massively tough. Well, at least men who kill women don't seem to be particularly tough guys.
No.
Or men that you'd find well, maybe women would, but men that other men wouldn't find particularly, what's the word? Intimidating, that's the word.
Because often there's an element of insecurity there, isn't there? Which is at the root of their fear that somebody's going to leave them or that they're never going to find somebody else, or this whole idea of somebody belonging to them and that, what's mine's mine. Nobody else is going to have the person, who's in a relationship with me. But yes, I mean, the whole motivation for murder is horrifying, isn't it? And again, although I love myself serial killer films and things, I mean, they're great. I won't say great fun, but I mean, they are engaging, entertaining, dare one say it.
They're sort of strange, vicarious things,
yes,
aren't they?
Yes. And it is fascinating to know why can somebody dehumanize another person to that extent that they can steal themselves, and that was just a total lack of empathy, isn't it? Say a psychopath just doesn't see the other person at all as somebody sort of sentient being in a sense. So I mean, all the murders in the books, they all arise from. There's no kind of weirdo character. They're all people who are responding to something in their lives. Then there's no weird psychopath who suddenly emerges. Because I mean, that's great. I read novels like that myself, but it's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in more ordinary people and the damage that those murders do to everybody around the victims.
Well, serial killers have sort of been done in a way, haven't they? I mean, they're very in the zeitgeist since Netflix really pushed a lot of its sort of serial killer documentaries. You've got a lot of stuff on Ted Bundy and of course you've got the Dennis Nielsen TV show, and they're great characters.
Yes.
If you're removing the fact that they were real life people and did some horrific things, they're very fascinating characters. But it's kind of done, isn't it? You've got the film Seven, and then you've got Saw, and you've got all these other films that have got all these interesting, complex, psychopathic characters, and you know, characters in Batman that are sort of serial killer like people, and it's been done, hasn't it? So I appreciate the angle that you're trying to take here, which is a bit more grounded, a little bit sort of you know, you're seeing this stuff through the eyes of other characters, I guess, and like you were saying, the impact, the waves, the ripples in the world.
Yes, yeah.
Which is often, they don't really focus on that often. They focus on sort of like gore porn.
Yes, which I don't really. I've just been reading the autobiography or memoir of Brian Masters, who is the writer who interviewed Dennis Nilsson, and he actually wrote the Killing for Company, and he also interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer and Dahmer's parents.
Wow!
And he wrote a book about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was commissioned in the States, and a lot of the thrust of the book was why Jeffrey Dahmer did what he did. And the book was turned down because the Americans didn't want to know why he did it. They were not interested in what had made him a serial killer.
They're only interested in the circus.
Yes, yeah.
Very interesting.
That's right.
A lot of the time when you dig into these guys, it is like you were saying earlier, it is I think with Dennis Nilsson and Jeffrey Dahmer, they were both gay, weren't they?
Yes,
there's an element of shame about their sexuality and hanging on to not wanting these people like to leave them. And definitely with Jeffrey Dahmer, he had a thing about people leaving him, walking out on him, and then people always go, "Oh, blame the parents," but very often, like Ed Kemper, he's an interesting one as well. He used to he said that the women, he was called the co-ed killer. He was my height as well, and he said that all along, and he had a genius IQ because he was a proper psychopath, so he thought he was smarter than everyone else. And he said that really all he was doing when he was killing these college girls was practicing killing his mother. He didn't realise. And then he killed his mum. And but when you hear the stories about some of these people, and you hear about how his mother treated him, you think,
there's usually something in childhood, isn't there, that just switches flicks a switch or doesn't flick the right switch.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody like Dennis Nilsson, I know somebody who remembers him when he was a shop steward. He was a civil servant.
Right.
He was a very compelling shop steward, very good orator.
Right.
But perhaps slightly, not creepy exactly, but perhaps not somebody you necessarily want to go to the pub with, but you'd never think,
Right.
What
so it
was
gives you the
going on?
heebie-jeebies enough. Yeah, there are certain people out there, you just get a vibe from them. And you're like, I like you, there's something off about you, I'm not 100% sure what it is, but it ain't cool. And I like you in principle, but I'm going to keep you at an arm's length. And I think there's a lot of these people, they probably start out a bit like that. And so that feeling of always being kept at arm's length by the world probably perpetuates those feelings of being unlovable or unwanted or not fitting in, because they just give out a scent that people and women go, I don't know what it is about you, but something in my instincts are telling me not to go home with you or get in the car with you.
Yes.
Fascinating. In your talk, were you talking about a well that was covered over?
Yes.
I thought that was fascinating. Can you go over, because that sort of features in here, doesn't it?
It's the very opening of the Promise of Salvation.
Right. And this is which book is this?
That's the fourth one.
The last book.
Yeah, the last one.
What a lovely segue into the last book.
When I grew up in Wilton, just outside Salisbury, and Groveley Wood is a wonderful wood. It's a forest that goes all sort of along the top of the downs through the Wiley Valley. And where the houses finish in Wilton, the wood begins, Groveley Wood begins, and the sort of chalk track, and it begins to get a little slightly spooky. I think you had to be of a nervous disposition to write crime, because if you aren't frightened by things, you don't know how to frighten people. But there was this big well thing that was like a brick well, like a large well. I can't remember exactly how big it was, surrounded by barbed wire, and it had corrugated iron laid across the top, all rusty. Very spooky. And we used to scare each other as kids when we used to walk up there or go up there. Well, we probably should have been at school or doing something else. Is there water there? What's down there? How far does it? How deep is it? And we kind of dare each other to look inside to see if you could see any water glinting under the surface, or whether it was just quite shallow. Nobody really knew what it was for. I think I did discover later it was some sort of a reservoir set up.
Right.
I think actually in the 1870s. It goes back a lot earlier than in the book. Because it's a fairly high point, I suppose, and there was a waterworks just a bit farther down the hillside. And in the book, there's a gale. The book opens in February.
Right.
And there's a gale, and the corrugated iron sheet blow off the top of this well and land in the garden of Barbara Trent, who lives in the last house in the terrace. And she goes up to investigate, and she's appalled at all the fly tipping that's gone on, and this well that's been filled in over the years by rubbish being posted in there. And her little dog, who she's taken out for a walk, is fascinated by all the new smells, leaps into the rubbish tip and sends everything rolling down. And as it rolls down, a small skeleton is revealed. And this is really how the book opens. I think, as I say, the well that used to be there has now been filled in. You can see it on old maps.
Right.
But I suppose it was the possibility and the kind of spookiness of this and what could be in there.
Yeah.
And I'd always kind of wanted to somehow put it into a book. So it had been in the back of my mind for quite a while that I would have something set there. And this idea of the gale blowing the iron sheets off into her garden, landing on her lawn, and her very cross kind of going to investigate and then seeing this little skeleton.
It's horror.
Yes.
It's almost like a narrative device, isn't it? Because it's something of mystery. I remember seeing a talk that J.J. Abrams did, and he was the guy who wrote Lost, the TV show Lost, which frustratingly never wraps up many of its narrative threads in the end, but nevertheless has an enormous amount of intrigue. And he was talking about the importance of this box that he had as a kid. It was a mystery box. And he said he's never opened it because he feels that now what will be inside will never ever live up to what he's created in his mind. So he has this box in his house from his childhood, doesn't know what's in it, and he doesn't plan on finding out. It's like magic trick stuff, but he doesn't know what. And I guess that well for you is that sort of thing where it could be anything to the reader. You've created it's created a something where you can almost fill in the blanks. And I guess that's why things like wells and caves and derelict buildings and things like that is because we fear what we don't understand, or we fear what we cannot see or control, or the unknown, isn't it?
Yes.
And so that well is a very cool piece of storytelling, I guess, because you can tell them what's in it, but they can imagine a lot more of what's happened in it, how it's happened, what else might be in there, and it's very cool. It's very compelling, I think.
Well, the thing is also that obviously this isn't true necessarily in real life, but in the book, that well had been sunk in a much older pit called Ploughboy's Pit,
right?
Which had been, again, sort of using the sort of moonraker idea that it was called Ploughboy's Pit because a little ploughboy had looked in and thought he'd seen this sort of silver coin glowing in the water and kind of leaned in to get it because it was a reflection of the moon, and he'd fallen in and drowned. And so you've got this sort of layers of history that, a long time ago, this little boy had drowned in a natural pit.
Right.
And then the army came along in the early years of the 1900s and created this reservoir for the army during the war. The army were all through the woods in the war. And now it's been used for rubbish and also as a last resting place for this little girl 20 years earlier she'd been abducted from a fun fair, as we discover.
Right.
And her body laying there until Barbara's little dog discovers it.
Interesting. And so that's and then so Lincoln gets involved. Is he the kind of guy that shows up to a crime scene, with like a big coat on, and it's like, what have we got here? Nothing phases him, or what kind? How does he? What is his brilliance other than being a compelling interesting three-dimensional character, what's his brilliance? He must be a good detective.
He's quite dogged, and he's quite a ditherer as well, and he makes mistakes. And the way I've written the books is that the reader will often know more than Lincoln, because different chapters will sometimes feature other characters. So sometimes you can see Lincoln and his team going down quite the wrong track, because it wasn't something that the reader already knows, that these other people were doing something. But he will kind of worry away at something. So, for instance, when one of the characters, one of the victims, is found in a flat, and the gentleman has taken his clothes off to, whatever. Anyway, and Lincoln goes into the spare room and sort of sees this chap's clothes on the bed and thinks, it's funny, and he sort of says to Woody, his sergeant, how do you take your clothes off? And Woody sort of, what? But I mean, what Lincoln has spotted is that the clothes are kind of in the wrong order. You wouldn't, if you'd sort of taken your clothes off and in that room,
right,
you'd probably
socks
take
off, trousers off.
Exactly, reverse order to the way that these are, and they're kind of heaped up. And the victim, who he'd met very briefly the day before, didn't strike him as somebody who would just sort of take his clothes off any old how and just drop them down. He would actually have put them carefully.
Yeah.
So that has struck Lincoln straight away as not quite right. And so what appears to be an accident or possibly suicide, Lincoln straight away thinks, I think there was somebody else here. I don't think this chap put these clothes on the bed the way these clothes have been put on the bed. So I think with Lincoln, he sort of get little flashes of inspiration. But what I always want to do is make sure it's quite clear how he's reached that conclusion. He doesn't suddenly have a flash of brilliance. There will be some way that he's built up to that. He will put things together and something will have accumulated so that he has reached that conclusion through logic. Not quite, like Holmes, but, he will have built up a case or perhaps eliminated other possibilities until he's reached what he thinks is what happened.
Right.
And so I sort of like to show him sometimes making mistakes. But also I like to show that point when he does realise what the actual answer is. And it's not always him, because he's got a team around him. And sometimes they will say, oh, look, this happened, this, perhaps it's this. And he'll say, oh, I don't think so. Then he'll perhaps reconsider it and accept that perhaps, Pam Smith has got that right, his DC. So it's not all down to him.
That is interesting. And I guess at the end, I don't want to ruin any of the endings, although there are 4 endings to potentially
to ruin.
ruin. I guess the end isn't like Scooby-Doo, where they're like, well, it's actually him or her, or Cluedo or whatever it is. How do you want the reader? This is probably a better question. How do you want the readers to feel at the end of your books? I mean, I don't know if there's cliffhangers. I don't know if there's any alluding to a murderer that may be free to murder another day in another volume. But how do you want your readers to feel at the end? Do you want them to feel like, oh, we're all safe? It's all, justice has been served, or do you still want to leave a slight feeling of sort of like unsettled and paranoid?
Not so paranoid, but there are some loose ends deliberately left.
Right.
Where, there's a character, Pete Doubleday, who crops up in several of the books. And he's somebody who's got away with it, at least for now. But, hopefully he'll get his comeuppance at some point in the series. I like the core of the book to be resolved. So the core crimes are resolved, so the reader is satisfied with that. But there's always that little chink left to pick up something which wasn't quite resolved in a later book. Okay.
Do you ever feel obligations to a reader to wrap things up? Do you ever feel like, oh, well, they've paid their money for this book, and I better deliver this? Or do you think, no, you pay your money, you take your chances, or you pay your money in the faith that you're being taken on a ride by you, and where you take that ride is up to you, and that's really what they're paying for is the journey? Or do you feel like, I guess what I'm saying, is there an obligation to wrap things up when you think, oh, really, I would like to keep that going for 4 books? I don't know if they have the patience for
I think you don't want to disappoint the reader. And certainly the old trick of sort of somebody, the culprit being somebody who you knew nothing about until, the chapter before the last, that's cheating. So I always want to make sure the reader can think, oh, actually, now I think about it, of course, I always want the reader to be able to work back if they needed to, but I want the reader to feel that everything is logical, that people's motivations, that's quite important to me, that you can understand why somebody did something. I don't just suddenly say, well, he did such and such. Why did he? I want the reader to sort of see how the characters have got to this point without suddenly saying, and he wrote a letter and explained everything. Obviously, it's a bit of a cop-out when somebody sort of sends a letter after the fact to explain all the things that happened. But I want the reader to kind of want to read on. So, in a sense, having a cliffhanger or having something left uncertain, so the reader might think, oh, I wonder what happens in the next book. And that's quite, I think there is this kind of partnership, if you like, between it sounds a bit corny, but between the reader and the writer, that you're in this together. And certainly if you're in it for 4 books or whatever, hopefully a 5th book, that you're going to get some reward for sticking with it.
Right. So it's a trust thing at this point.
I think, yes, definitely.
Because book 1 is, you pay your money, you take a chance, don't you? At this point, at least for you, I guess to many you were an unknown quantity, I guess, or whatever. And so they take a chance. Then by book 3, it's more, all right, Nikki, where are we going with this one then, isn't it? Which is really lovely. It's really lovely. And of course, every reader is going to have a different relationship to the characters in this book. You can't control. There's an element of that you cannot control, which I think is really very interesting because it's like songs, isn't it? People will interpret whatever they like. Some people interpret some really wild things from songs.
Yes.
And so some people will be doing that with your characters as well. And I wonder if that scope, that sort of ambiguity works in your favour in a way, because you can sort of, you can be a bit free with where you take these people and what you do to them, I guess, because you know that there's so many varying spectrums of how people feel about each character. So it's sort of...
Well, I think because from the beginning, because of this horrible story, this murder, I had to disguise it. I couldn't say it was set in Salisbury. I had to disguise it. At one point, I thought, I wish I hadn't had to do that. But on the other hand, it's given me a lot of freedom so that I can play around with the topography, for instance. So places, for instance, in The Price of Silence, at one point, the... things happen at Lookout Hill. Well, if anybody knows Salisbury or the Southampton Road, there's a Pepperbox Hill, Ayres Folly on Pepperbox Hill, up the dual carriageway. I've made that much closer to Barbary than Pepperbox really is to Salisbury because of, for the sake of the plot.
Right.
But if anybody knows Salisbury, they can possibly think, well, I wonder if that's based on... and they can kind of guess what I had in mind. But I was saying something the other day, it's funny how you base things on your experience without even realising it. In The Price of Silence, after this murder at the public toilets, the team sets up a forward post in some mobile classrooms at the community college just across the dual carriageway. And the idea being if any eyewitnesses want to come forward or they want to have teams based there close to the scene of the crime, they'll be there for a few days. And I obviously wrote that probably about 1990 and didn't really think much of it. Then a few years ago, I suddenly thought, I know what was in my mind when I created that and had this forward post in a mobile classroom next to the college. When I was probably still at school, so we're talking like 1969, 1970, my sister and I did a pedestrian census I don't know how we got onto it, where we had to sit in this classroom by the Technical College in Salisbury to watch people using a footpath.
Right.
We sat there all day, and I think 17 people walked by.
Right.
But obviously that experience stuck in my mind somewhere. So,
Right.
when I came to write the novel, I straight away had this idea of, there's a mobile classroom there that they can use, that they're going to set up in a mobile classroom. And where that memory had been lurking all that time, I don't know, but somehow it was there. And I think if you're a writer, you have all these memories, these things you kind of build up as a little catalogue of things, and then you perhaps turn back to them later. And you think, did I invent that, or was that real? And it's quite a strange experience, really.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? You're not sick of your character yet?
No, I mean, I think after I got the fourth one published, or when it was kind of on its way to coming out, I thought, I think I've had enough of this. It's just, because, I think if you're an independent author, you've got to work so hard at promotion.
Right.
And you see people on Twitter saying, I'm past 100,000 followers.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, goodness sake, what's that, 73 or something? No, slightly more than that, but not that many. And Froome Writers Collective, we had as a guest recently Kerry Wilkinson, who used to go to Froome College, he used to live in Froome.
Right.
And he's a phenomenally successful crime writer.
Oh, is he?
He lives in Canada now.
Right.
But he's just got sold thousands of copies of his books, and I haven't really sold that many. I thought, perhaps I'll stop now. But then people began to say, well, when's the fifth one coming out? And I'm thinking, and also thought, well, I don't really want to stop yet, because I haven't finished the story yet. I haven't finished Lincoln's story. And I just suddenly thought, no, I think I will carry on. I'll just perhaps do book 5, and so I've begun that now. And
right, interesting. Well, you've 5 books in, something's working, isn't it? And if people are asking for a 5th book, you're connecting with someone somewhere. And I do know a few people that write on a sort of the independent level, and it does seem to be a huge slog, let's say.
It is. It's because there's so much out there.
Yeah.
And then you get readers on Facebook or something saying, you get this for free. And you think, for goodness, do you not realise how what independent writers, what it costs us, in effect?
Yeah.
If I sell my books through a bookshop, I make £1 per copy. That's the profit I get, really.
Right.
So
it's for the love.
you do it for you end up doing it for love. There's no point. I had at one point I had to think to myself, do I want to do it for the money? I should be so lucky. Or do I want to do it because I love doing it, and I love the fact that people say, I really enjoyed your book, and that is really what satisfies me more than the royalty statements. Royalty statements would be lovely as well. I've had some nice income, but it's just so nice to have people say they've enjoyed the books.
Yeah.
And to sort of say, is that based on such and such? And it's just so nice. It's just, you do feel kind of part of a community. It does sound corny, doesn't it? But
no, not at all.
And it's nice that what I have found is a lot of older men seem to enjoy the books.
Right.
Or perhaps they just take the trouble to sort of say they've enjoyed the books, which I think is nice, because a lot of older men, or men generally, don't read fiction. They perhaps read it when they're young,
fiction,
but
really.
no.
I tend to read non-fiction if I read at all. I've got ADHD, so I do find it quite difficult to. It's more. I don't find it difficult to sit and read. Once I do it, I can enjoy it. It's the idea of being like, right, we're going to sit down and we're going to sit still, and we're only going to have our eyes stimulated right now. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So
yes.
It can be difficult, but I do love reading a good book. When I have been wanting to read some fiction for a long time. A friend of mine said, he said to me once when I was talking to him about my reading habits and how he likes to read fiction as well. He said, well, the good thing with fiction, and I hadn't even thought about this, is that you really get to figure out what's going on in the head of the author. And I thought that is a fantastic perspective that I hadn't even thought of, because, you'd think when you're reading a book, it's the author being like, well, we're not talking about me, we're talking about this. But it's what it's all coming from your mind, isn't it? It's all coming from, and so, you look at someone like Stephen King and you think, oh, he's probably a messed up man, right?
Yeah.
Because it's coming from that mind.
Yes.
And as you said, to write crime, you must be of a slightly nervous disposition or slightly disturbed. And I do think that's interesting that a lot of people can extrapolate things about you and your imagination and who you are from how you compose this whole thing, this whole world, orchestrate, what's going on in the book. Do you think there are any authors out there that are particularly sort of revealing with their work about who they are as people that you like?
I don't know. I think Stephen King has got some great advice for writers, but I don't find his style. He has some great ideas for books, but I don't like his writing style. I'm not sure. I mean, I think I like Kate Atkinson. I like her Jackson Brodie series. But she's quite elusive as a writer, and I think she's not everybody's cup of tea. And I also like Ian Rankin. I love the Rebus books. And John Harvey, who created Charlie Resnick. And they're set in Nottingham.
Right.
And you can tell he's a poet, and you can tell he loves the blues, because there's a rhythm to his language.
Right.
And a spontaneity to his language that is just shines through.
I love
He's
that.
a great writer.
I love that. We're going to wrap this up in a moment, but I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the slog of being an independent writer, when books like 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight become huge international hits, almost culture defining, yet people who really know books say they're written like trash, does that anger you? Does it annoy you? Or are you just pleased that it's engaging more people with writing?
I'm pleased it engages people and gives people hope that if you write independently, you can get somewhere. It's frustrating because you think, oh, those people could have spent money on better books, but then you can't say to somebody, you've got to like that, you've got to like this, you've got to love this book.
Yeah.
All you can do is make them aware of it and hope they discover the book. And I think that's getting back to Free Writers Collective and Silver Crow books, I'm so grateful for both of them. Silver Crow, because it helps promote the books that we've all written. And it's very difficult, I think, as an independent writer to push yourself forward, because I think most writers by nature are shy. We're spectators. We aren't out there, being extrovert. We tend to be introvert. So it's difficult to say, I'm a brilliant writer, you'll really love this.
Right. Yeah, it does require...
top this.
Yeah.
And so it's good that you kind of got that excuse to say, push other people's books as well.
Yeah.
I hope they'll do the same for you. But just simply to put across that if you're an independent writer, there are ways of getting published, of getting publicised, of getting support to, for instance, if you've just written something, you've just got something published and you think, well, how on earth do I go into a bookshop and do a talk? I don't know what to do. But if you've got somebody else with you who sort of knows the ropes a bit and can kind of push you forward, and it's a hand-holding exercise, really, that you're not on your own, because I think that's the thing about writing independently. You feel very much on your own. Everybody knows far more about the technology of creating books, doing stuff on Amazon, the Kindle books and so on, all the technical stuff, but also the whole thing about pricing and who does what and who takes what cut and all the legal stuff. And there's just so much out there. If you aren't with a traditional publisher, you've got to handle all that stuff yourself. And it really is a 24/7 task, or you can let it be a 24/7 task. But to know that you've got somebody who you can turn to and say, look, I've had this problem with the printer. Can you just sort of say to him, what do I say to him? Because he's telling me this. Is this right?
Right.
Just to turn to somebody else who will give you friendly support and a bit of advice. And that's just so enriching, the whole experience of writing and publishing independently, to have that little bit of a fallback for somebody to be there in the background to kind of pick up the pieces and to put you straight. That's really good. And I think it's the essence of Froome, isn't it? Really, is the Froome Writers Collective is just that. It's just so supportive, and I think there is. We won't get political, but I think there is this element of cooperation and helpfulness and kind of doing things together, and to try and do things better.
Yeah, I agree. I can't remember what I said at the beginning of that Writers Collective meeting. Something about Froome being like the centre of the universe, and that any creative endeavour here will and can be supported.
Yes.
And you don't have to throw a stone very far before you find someone with the knowledge or the skills that you need. But talking of enriching, this has been a very enriching conversation. Thank you very much.
You enjoyed it.
I have, since when I saw you do the talk at the collective, I wanted to have this conversation. So I'm really pleased that.
Well, thank you.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice.